Our gospel lesson today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. On that day when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" He woke up and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
Monday, the 13th of November. Soon after the morning blessing, as we all sat together quite nicely and blessedly, there came terrible weather. It thundered and flashed and rained and was so dark that we could see almost nothing. At that point, all windows were closed and all sails furled, and we were driven around that way the whole day and the following night during the most terrible storm. The waves in the evening were really tumultuous. One after another crashed into the ship so that everything trembled and quaked, and it was as if everything would go to pieces. A wave once gave such a jolt that poor Juliana Weckler was thrown from one side of the ship to the other onto a crate, which could have broken her skull. It missed hitting her temple by certainly no more than half a finger width, and we would have lost her from our company before she or we could have really comprehended it.
Boat travel is scary. It would be for me anyway. Which is why it's lucky for me that I was not an 18th century Moravian, because in order to spread the gospel, they traveled on boats all the time. The quote you've just heard Ginny read is from the travel diary of Anna Johanna Pisch, who in 1752, at age 26, led a party of 17 single Moravian sisters on a transatlantic migration from Germany to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Now, it's also lucky for me that I was not one of Jesus' first disciples, because they also spent a lot of time in boats. They were at home on the water. The very first disciples were fishermen, after all. So it's kind of surprising to realize that in the Gospel of Mark, once those first disciples have abandoned their nets to follow Jesus, it is a good while before they're back on a boat. From the time they first meet Jesus to the time just before today's story, they've mostly been walking and sitting and listening and watching. And they have heard and seen amazing things. They've heard Jesus say, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." They've heard a person afflicted with skin disease say to Jesus, "If you choose, you can make me clean." And they've heard Jesus respond, "I do choose." And they have seen the sufferer healed. Over and over, they have heard Jesus respond to challenges from the Pharisees, questions about forgiveness, association with sinners, and religious law. And they've heard Jesus answer with words that have left the Pharisees gaping like fish. Words like, "I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." And the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. And is it lawful to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life, or to kill? These are some of the things they have heard, to which the things they have seen, the healings before their eyes, have given depth and resonance. When our story takes place, they've been listening all day as Jesus unspooled parable after parable. Most of the parables have been about seeds. Who sows them? What challenges them? How they grow and what they turn into. It has been a day deeply rooted in the earth, but now as evening falls, These guys who set out to fish for people are finally returning to the sea. Let's hear the first part of the story again. On that day, when evening had come, Jesus said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd behind, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. Other boats were with him. A great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that the boat was already being swamped. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him up and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Boat travel is such a good metaphor for life's journey, isn't it? So much of what happens to us in life can be described in the language of the sea. We chart our course and set sail for new places. We navigate life's challenges, looking for a guiding star. We hope to be well anchored, yet we are often adrift. And like the disciples in this story, we are sometimes swamped. When we are completely out of sight of all our landmarks and unable to establish any direction in our lives, we are all at sea. And all at sea is a tough place to be. I've been there many times, and I expect that you have too. And since today is a prayer day for youth, I would like to share with the youth that many of my at-sea experiences happened when I was young. Between 5th and 9th grade, I lived in 4 different cities and went to 7 different schools. Seemed like every time I regained my land legs, another boating metaphor, I had to get right back on the water. And then came high school, and then college, and then the really, really difficult time after college when suddenly no one handed me a schedule and told me where to go and what to do. All at sea. Swamped and crying to Jesus, "Teacher, don't you care that I am perishing?" Now, I cried to Jesus because I had the benefit of 2,000 years of Christian tradition that assured me that Jesus could help. But looking at the story today, I don't know why the disciples cried out. When they woke Jesus up, what were they expecting him to do? They had not known him very long. And nothing in this story, and nothing in the 3.5 chapters of Mark that precede it, indicates that the disciples knew that Jesus could stop wind and still waves. They've never seen him do it before, so why would they expect him to do it now? Notice that no one in the story says, "Hey, wake Jesus up so he can stop this storm." Instead, when they wake him up, what they say is, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Well, you know what happened next. Jesus woke up and he stopped the wind and he stilled the waves. And then he turned to the disciples and he said, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" Now that is a funny question. It's not "have you no faith," but the very different "have you still no faith?" Evidently, by this time they should. Jesus seems disappointed. He seems to think that during all the days before, they've been receiving and apparently failing to absorb specific lessons in faith, what it is, how to develop it, and how to hold on to it. But go back and read. Because if you're looking for specific instructions on how to develop and hold on to faith, you will not find them in the first 3.5 chapters of the Gospel of Mark. In fact, the word faith appears only once in those 3.5 chapters, and it's the narrator and not Jesus who uses it. And yet the disciples have spent days listening and watching. So what lessons have they missed that should have helped them on the water that night? They'd heard Jesus say, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." They heard Jesus affirm that he chose to heal a person's disease. And what about those challenges to the Pharisees when Jesus said he came to call sinners, or those lessons on how the Sabbath was made for humankind and whether it was lawful on the Sabbath to save a life? And what about all those parables emphasizing the importance and potential of every seed? What faith could they have learned from these words of Jesus? And what was the question that their faith could have answered? When the disciples shook Jesus awake in the boat, their question was not, "Teacher, can you do something?" Their question was, "Don't you care?" The faith they were lacking was the faith that their lives mattered to Jesus. And yet they had seen over and over that for Jesus, life mattered more than anything. Not just being alive, but full life. Life that filled a calling. Life that conquered pain and found healing. Life that superseded the rules of the Pharisees. Life that gave rise to more life, like seeds that grow into fantastic shady trees. The disciples' lives mattered to Jesus because full human life mattered to Jesus. They should have known that by now. On the other hand, on that stormy night, Jesus did seem pretty casual about the possibility that lives might be lost. Which brings us to another lesson that the disciples missed. That life is never lost because life begins and ends in God. Indeed, that is why life matters. As Paul wrote in Romans 14, "If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's." Or as it says in our Moravian burial liturgy, we belong to the Lord. Maybe Jesus was disappointed that the disciples still didn't know who they belonged to. Maybe he was disappointed that they were afraid to die. This brings up another story of Moravians traveling by boat, and this is a famous one. It's from the diary of John Wesley, whose work for God eventually launched a movement we now call the United Methodist Church. In 1735, John and Charles Wesley caught a ship from England to America, and among the passengers were Moravians on their way to Georgia. And as the Moravians were at worship one day, a terrible storm developed, and most of the passengers, including John Wesley, were terrified. But hear what Wesley later wrote in his diary.
"In the midst of the psalm wherewith their service began, the sea broke over, split the mainsail in pieces, covered the ship, and poured in between the decks, as if the great deep had already swallowed us up. A terrible screaming began among the English. The Germans calmly sang on. I asked one of them afterwards, 'Were you not afraid?' He answered, 'I thank God, no.' I asked, 'But were not your women and children afraid?' He replied mildly, 'No, our women and children are not afraid to die.' The storm was boisterous, but the Moravians kept praising God. Finally, the storm subsided."
The Moravians had faith that whether they lived or they died, they belonged to the Lord. And I would venture to say that the Moravians who emphasized the importance of Christian community also knew that they belonged to one another. Now, I said a while back that the word faith appears only once in Mark before today's story. And it comes in the 2nd chapter, where 4 men dig through the roof of a house and lower their paralyzed friend through the hole so that Jesus can see him. And the narrator tells us that when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Perhaps the faith that Jesus saw and responded to was the 4 men's conviction that the life of their friend mattered to Jesus. Faith assures us that all of life matters to God. We live our faith by treating others as though their lives matter as much as our own. That's the kind of faith that builds community. And community is what we need when we are all at sea, with no landmarks to guide us except the assurance that we belong. The assurance of belonging is what heartened the Moravians on the ship with Wesley. And I imagine it also heartened poor Juliana Weckler, the one who was half a finger's width from the deadly head wound on the ship with Anna Joanna Peace. Anna Joanna's diary tells us that the day after the storm, the travelers celebrated communion, and they took care to serve Juliana, who was still in bed, recovering. Communion assured her that she belonged. But I think that my favorite Moravian story of travel through water comes from the travel diary of Salome Moirer. In 1766, Salome was one of 16 single sisters who traveled 500 miles from Pennsylvania to North Carolina, most of it on foot. Almost all of them were teenagers. Sometimes they had to cross rivers or creeks, and here's what Salome says about a few particularly difficult miles.
October 27th. We came to several creeks without bridges and had to climb onto the wagon. Sometimes we just hung onto the sides. The brothers tied the girls together with thick ropes in groups of 4 so that none would fall under.
What a lesson. That when we set out on a dangerous crossing, we are safer when we are tied together. We belong to one another. Because whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord, who made us all and receives us all. So we can trust that we matter, and we can have faith that when we are all at sea, we are never alone. Thanks be to God. Amen. On this prayer day for youth, Reverend Heil, Andrew, and I would like to take time to offer a blessing to all those who are of middle school age, high school age, or college age. You're welcome to come up here to the front and be blessed. And we also have, Andrew, would you get that little basket? We have a small basket with a physical reminder of the blessing that came from the seashore. So if you'd like to take one of that after a blessing, you are most welcome. And I invite the congregation to sing hymn 757 while we do the blessing. Whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord, and all that we have belongs to the Lord. At this time, let us present our tithes and our offerings.